Welcome to the walkthrough of the frequently made mistakes I discovered while reviewing Assignment 2 submissions for my CS 5253 class in fall of 2022. First, make sure you implement all the methods in the classes or else you lose major points, as per item 13 in the frequently asked questions file at this URL. Also, please make sure to document your code thoroughly. In particular, each aggregate operation should have a comment describing what it does. And also, please don't remove the to-do tags. It makes it much more difficult for me to review the code. So let's take a look at some of the problems I ran into. Here's an example. Please make sure that for the transform image remotely method, you use a parallel stream, not just a stream. Because after all, this is the parallel streams crawler.java file on the client side. Make sure you implement the methods. This one was left blank, so make sure you implement it, otherwise you'll lose points. Please chain methods together using the fluent interface pattern rather than splitting them across multiple local variables. Also, please don't comment your code like this since it's very hard to read because the lines are wrapping like crazy. Let's now go ahead and take a look at some of the problems I saw on the server side. First, this is the wrong constant to apply here. You don't want to be using apply transform. You want to use apply transforms with an S. Secondly, this implementation is way too complicated. Just forward the appropriate parameters to the image service apply transform method, or transforms method. Here's another problem with annotations. This annotation is too complicated. You don't need to have all this stuff about consumes and so on. Also, make sure you use the symbolic constant instead of having the string apply transforms. Also, there's no need to have a response body annotation here. That's handled by using the request controller annotation for the overall class. Please make sure you annotate parameters like lists properly as request params. And also here, make sure you use request part, as we discussed in class, for the multi-part file image rather than using request param. It's entirely unclear why this code is here. The implementation code should never be in the controller. The controller should just forward to the main service that does all the actual code. So this code doesn't belong here. We'll talk later. This code is also incorrect because it needs to be refactored. Please make sure to add the proper annotations here. This code doesn't have any annotations, so that's not going to work. Likewise, now moving into the transform controller file, this annotation is incomplete. You actually have to give the name of the annotation here inside of these parens, so that's missing. Please make sure that you use the symbolic constant instead of using apply transform. Down here, this code is too complicated. You don't need to put all this consume stuff. And note also that this is the wrong constant that's being passed in. It should be apply transform with no S as opposed to apply transforms. Let's now go take a look at some of the implementation issues. Here's apply transforms. This code is very duplicative. There's no need to repeat code like this. It should not be done this way. It needs to be refactored so there's just one piece of code that does this stuff, and you can basically have a conditional check to see if you want to use a stream or a parallel stream. So make sure that you apply the don't repeat yourself principle when writing code like this. Please use the 3-parameter version of post for object rather than the 4-parameter version. You don't need to pass in the post string, for example. This code here is incomplete and won't compile, so make sure that you pass the right parameters and do the right logic here to make things work properly. Here's another problem with post request. I'm not sure why this code is calling itself recursively, but that's not going to end well because it's going to infinitely recurse, which is a bad thing. This also gives me an indication that the tests weren't run, so make sure you run the tests. They should flag a problem like this. There's no need to create the HTTP headers object here, and there's no need to create this HTTP entity object. Just use the version of post for object where you just pass in the data structure directly. This code doesn't work. I'm not quite sure what it's trying to do, but you need to make sure you call the discovery client properly, and you don't need to be doing all this stuff. Instead, what you want to do is basically call a method on the discovery client and then convert that into a stream. And this is not the way to do that. I don't even know what this is doing, but it's definitely not going to work. Down here, please use something other than stream support.stream. It works, but it's kind of awkward. So instead, you could use something like this where you use the ternary expression to either make a parallel stream or a sequential stream. Please don't use anonymous interclasses. They're way, way, way too verbose. Just use a method reference here. Likewise, there's no reason to use a lambda expression here in the transform service constructor, but instead use the method reference. Much, much more concise. Please check the result of mTransform get and store it in a local variable so you can check for null before calling apply. And if there is a null back, please throw no such element exception. We're actually going to improve this in the next version of the assignment to use an optional instead of using checks for null. We'll talk about that later, but this will get you up and running for the time being. And this code makes no sense. Why is the main controller's apply transforms method being called inside of the apply transform method in the transform controller service? Makes no sense whatsoever. You need to implement this in a slightly different way. And then finally, here's another implementation of apply transform that's incorrect. This is way too complicated. You don't need to do the stream filter map for each stuff. Instead, go ahead and use transform get, doing the appropriate checks to make sure that you handle nulls properly. So that's the end of my walkthrough of the problems I saw and the things that can be improved when reviewing the assignment 2 submissions for CS 5253.